welcome to an annual tradition here at Upstream, the Maintainer State of the Union panel. We look forward to this panel every year because it's a chance to hear directly from the maintainers themselves. My name is Amy Hayes, and I'm the Upstream event chair. I've helped plan Upstream over the past 3 years. I'll be joined as host by Kanish Sharma, who heads our product and content marketing here at Tidelift. Kanish also worked very closely on our most recent maintainer survey, so he has key insights into those findings. We'll be your co-host and tag team this session. Now, enough about us. Without further ado, I'd like to ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. Jason, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Gary, and then to Ceki. Who are you? What projects do you maintain, and how did you get started?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I'm Jason Coombs, Jiraco online, and I've been passionate about Python for over 20 years now, and I've been picking up open source projects. I started out with contributing Win32 time zone to the PyWin32 project, contributing Symlink support for Windows in core Python, and I got involved with Setuptools in 2009-ish to make sure that it could support Python 3, and that actually it was distribute and then Setuptools. And at this point, I'm maintaining over 150 packages in pypi and doing core Python maintainership. So I've recently been working on importlib metadata, importlib resources, and other, I guess, facilitary libraries. I support Cherrypy and IRC libraries in Python through Tidelift. And so, yeah, it's been quite a ride. I do enjoy it, and I'm looking forward to talking on this panel.
My name's Gary Gregory, and I do mostly Java development. I do a lot of FOSS work at the Apache Software Foundation, mostly Apache Commons and also HTTP components, logging services, Juno, Mina, and Xalen. So these are all Java-based open source projects. Really got started both using and contributing to avoid reinventing the wheel at work, basically. And I've been doing that for probably almost 20 years.
So my name is Ceki Gülcü. I have started working on open source a long time ago, around 1998 or so. First on the predecessor of Log4j. Actually, it was, I think, also called Log4j. And I donated Log4j by invitation to Apache, to the Apache Software Foundation. Maintained Log4j from 2000, early 2000 until 2005, at which time I founded the SLF4j project, which is one of the most deployed artifacts in the Java ecosystem. Actually, it's probably the most deployed artifact. So SLF4j is associated with Logback, which I also maintain. And recently in last year, I created the Reload4j project, which is Log4j1 with the security vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities patched. And and I continue maintaining these projects until today. And I'm happy to participate in this panel.
Very happy to have you. Thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited to hear from you. I'm going to hand the mic over to Kanish for the next question.
Yeah, it's really, privileged to have your company here today. Thank you so much. I feel like an absolute novice with all your experience and background in open source. So, but here's my question for you. So we have seen that open source maintainers are being asked to do more and more to improve the security posture of their packages. What are your thoughts on the overall health of the open source software ecosystem?
I can take some of that if anybody else wants to go before. I see things pretty positively, but I might be an eternal optimist. For me, it looks good and very vibrant. And I say this mostly because it's never been easier to start an open source project, to get it off the ground and to get it publicized. We're so far beyond, bulletin boards and mailing lists. It feels like a new open source project can take off and I don't want to use the word viral, but it can spread through the ecosystem pretty quickly. Now, for projects like the ones that I maintain that have been around for a long time, we're talking decades, maintenance can be an issue, and there are two broad areas that I have in mind. The first one, obviously, is security. It's just the code gets old, it gets banged on, and things happen. And also another issue is that the ecosystem itself, the platform that it relies on, are also progressing and moving along. And I'm thinking in terms of Java, say things like JPMS or the JavaX, the Jakarta naming mess. So there are several categories of issues that require active maintenance. Otherwise, projects get forked, or they get dumped, or they get copied, or all sorts of things have unintended consequences. But so overall, I see it pretty positive, but it definitely needs a lot of babying.
Yeah, I noticed the question focused on security, but I in general in the ecosystem, it feels like things really are going great. The CICD is just available, easy to get adopted. The ecosystems are getting simpler, but also more sophisticated, and so users can get in and do a lot more. But one concern I have is the barrier to entry, because it used to be you learn a source controlled system, you write some code and you push that code up, and that was it. That was all you did. Then you needed to have release pipelines in order to get things into an artifact repository of some kind. And then there was CICD, and then linting systems and testing systems, and it starts to pile on. There's really quite a bit to learn before you can be effective in the community, and get that hello world out there. Takes a lot of work. So that's one thing I'd like to work on, is to allow a contributor to focus on their core value, whether that's writing docs or writing the code or adding value to the system without having to think about all of the concerns. But as far as security goes, I feel like it's fairly robust. There's a healthy interest in improving security in the Python ecosystem. They're adding two-factor authentication to the most important pypi maintainers projects, and I imagine that's happening in other ecosystems as well.
A number of things have been said, and I agree with Gary that things pile up, especially if you have a project which has a lot of users. Over time, the maintenance burden is quite high. I mean, I'm quite thinking about it. I'm quite astonished that new features or actually new bugs are being found by users on a regular basis, and it's more and more corner cases. It's not obvious cases. Each new report actually takes a lot of time to understand what's going on. So the burden keeps piling up. That's one issue. I think that's obvious for kind of an obvious thing to say. Regarding security, okay, so security, what I see now, there's this circus about security. A lot of people, there's a lot of noise, but the signal to noise ratio is not that good, in my opinion. There are some serious bugs, serious vulnerabilities which are found from time to time, but most of the reports that I get are kind of not serious, and it takes almost just as much time to analyze them than actual serious bugs. And the decision to see if a bug is serious or not is quite a difficult one, right? So you cannot discard security issues offhand, but at a certain point you have to take a stand as well and say this vulnerability, this report is not serious. So that takes some courage, and
Yeah, I'd like to echo 2 points that were made from Jason. I think it's important to underscore the value of CI/CD. For me specifically, GitHub. I think I'm able to offload a tremendous amount of work that I would otherwise have to do by hand. In the old days, we picked up patches attached to a Jira ticket, for example. Then you'd have to apply it locally. You'd run through all the checks. But today, I mean, I'm assuming that, the projects I work on are set up are not only mirrored on GitHub for Apache, but they're also set up with a GitHub build. And if that's not the case, that's the first thing I propose to do when I join a project. Because if somebody sends a ticket or an email asking about a bug fix or a feature, I can just request something to be posted on GitHub. And then the fact that a GitHub build goes all the way through, if you have a Maven build, for example, or a kind of build that does all sorts of checks beyond just test, that saves me a tremendous amount of time, and it gives me a slightly better confidence that now I'm not going to waste time looking at this PR. And also to echo what Ceki said, I spend a lot of time, especially recently, reading, analyzing wannabe CVE reports. And some are valid, but there's a lot of people that it feels, they're really one that get their name in lights. They've got their one-man security operation, and they want to get credit. And that time is completely invisible to everybody else unless you're on the private mailing list for the Apache security team. And it's not even visible to users. So users don't even know that there are issues being analyzed or that people are spending time doing that. So there's a little bit of a big black hole there that nobody sees, but that needs to be fed.
One thing I've been doing about that particular issue is that when I have a report that is plausibly actionable, I'll file a bug in the open system saying there's a reported security vulnerability, this bug is tracking that, and I don't disclose anything else, right? Just something to tie to it, at least a date and a time, that it's been worked on. And then later I might go back and refill it, and add the details once it's been fixed, or link fix, to it so that it can be found later. But so that helps a little bit, but it still doesn't solve the problem of the incentives, where there is an incentive to find vulnerabilities, even if they're not practically a threat.
Thank you all so much. That one comment, especially about the number of CVEs coming into you all, really resonates. I was just here at the Gartner Application Development Summit in Las Vegas. I spoke with several people in the decision making roles for enterprise architecture, software development, platform engineering. Oftentimes, their response was, "Yeah, we just want to find vulnerabilities and ship it to the maintainers to address it." So it's not a sustainable approach by any means. But let me not waste too much time and get to the next question that I have here. So here it goes. Open source usage is growing at a significant rate, both amongst hobbyists and large organizations. With that in mind, what are you most concerned about? Where do you feel like things are going great, and what do you feel things need more attention? And maybe we can start with Jason this time.
Yes, things are certainly growing, but I guess that also means there are more people to contribute. So one of the areas I've been focusing in is trying to mentor and identify people who are passionate and interested and who can take share some of the burden. And I've been liberal in doing that, right? I know that it's a lot of times it's easy to want to maintain control, and that's going to be important for stability, but I think it's more important for long-term maintainability to just reach out and try to engage contributors and to see if they can upgrade from being a contributor to a maintainer. And so I'm doing that on all of my big projects and looking for co-maintainers and or at the very least somebody to take over should I not be maintaining it. And I do appreciate that ecosystems like GitHub are helping facilitate that, putting in mechanisms to make co-maintainers available as a process.
Yeah, I think I can echo a little bit of that, Jason. I think there's kind of a ping pong thing that I see, is that I feel like I need to make a better job to come up with guidelines of how to contribute. And there's kind of some hand waving that I do with GitHub, where I say, if you create a PR and it's a green branch build, that's great. But The unexplained is, well, we have a check style plugin that validates the style of code. Maybe we use spot bugs, maybe we use PMD, or we do expect for you to write a unit test if you make changes, a new feature or a bug fix. So I think if I did a better job at providing upfront guidance, through a better website, a better README, or better something, that would help the end user or the end developer to contribute. Now, the bigger picture is that also, Tidelift is also super helpful in supporting me, because now I actually feel good about spending extra time doing this stuff. And I think the emotional health of a project is another thing, we rarely talk about, only when something goes drastically wrong and we know people are under tremendous stress to fix a CD, for example.
So the question of finding maintainers or additional maintainers is quite a tricky one, and I should perhaps take this opportunity to thank Gary. That
Both of us.
Yes, yes. Um, uh, when I started working on when I stopped working on Log4j1, I think after a while you picked up the tab and maintained Log4j1 for quite a while. So I should thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you for laying the foundation. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, yes, that's true. So yeah, the question of finding maintainers, it's so what I see most of the time, most contributors are motivated by their immediate needs, and so they provide a patch which has some very limited or very defined scope. They contribute and they leave. So people who stay for the long term, on the long run, are quite rare. And actually, when it happens, you also have to get along with them, so which is not always easy. Um, yeah, so it's I think it's a very tricky subject, and I must say I'm not, I'm not the best at that, so I shouldn't give any advice for anyone.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important is consistency and longevity. I mean, that's kind of how I look at potential contributors. I mean, otherwise, most people they're drive-by PRs or drive-by contributors.
Another thing I've been doing that helps me with scaling my own contributions is separating the code of each project from the skeleton, the scaffold that supports it. So all of the test setups and project facilitation, the release process, and I've been contributing to that in a separate repository. So that helps me get consistency, and then I'll merge that repository into each of the project repositories, and that allows me to kind of track a history and do something once and then apply it to a number of projects. And I've even started to build automation around that, so that I will go and say, okay, I'm dropping support for Python 3.7 in all of my projects, and I'll make the change to the project manifest to make that work, and then merge that into all the projects, and then they get it in a matter of minutes versus looking at each one. And that also provides a benefit with contributors. If they want to change, they want to customize the CICD, my first question is this something that applies to this project specifically, or is this something that should influence the way we think about developing Python projects or think about developing this subset of them? And if so, let's apply it over there, or let's discuss this about should it apply more broadly, and use that as a way to scale that contribution to a larger number of projects. And so I've made that available. It's called Jiraco/skeleton in GitHub. And so I've got a blog entry that describes how that works, and it's actually interesting. It's got a couple of quirks, but it's worked pretty well. It would work better if our source code control systems had better overlay support or ways of thinking about more than one history in a repository.
You all are making some amazing points. I just wanted to say, Jason, sounds like you're separating the coding and the operational components of building a project. And I think that is a really unique way of building code. And then Gary, you also mentioned the emotional health component. I think that is a very refreshing way of phrasing it. What I heard a lot this week again was, we're concerned about longevity. And what we tend to think about over here is succession planning, right? Long-term succession planning. But I don't think we've looked at it through the lens of emotional health. And I think that is a very important thing that Amy, you and I can bring to the Tidelift approach with engaging with our maintainers.
I think your commentary just now will fit in very nicely with this next question, which is, what are some ways you think organizations and open source users can help open source maintainers most?
Usually my first reply to a PR or a ticket is thank you for your interest in the project or thank you for your PR before I say anything else. Because I remember a million years ago, I had created like a clone of the JVM and it did something. I don't know what it did. It logged fancier stack traces or something. And I posted it to some message board, mailing list thing. And the first reply I got with somebody was, well, congratulations, you just, did something trivial and banal. And I thought, oh my God, what an unwelcoming comment. Why would anybody want to be in this community? So I think, I'm trying to lead by example. I don't always succeed. Sometimes I'm short and curt. But I expect the same from people who come in and contribute, because when there is a big CD or security issue, it's going to be super stressful. So we might be short, and it's helpful to have a nicer, amenable community. It makes a huge difference. I think like during the whole Log4Shell meltdown, we saw the best and worst out of users. And it was kind of a large scale version of what I see sometimes from people posting on mailing lists, which ranges from people who are very grateful that we're doing anything really to how can you release software that doesn't have this feature, or how come you haven't fixed this, or this bug was reported 5 years ago and nothing's happening. It's all over the place. So there's only so much a small group of people can do in a given amount of time. So there's some misperception, maybe it's education, that it's not obvious to a lot of people that we're volunteers and we put in the best amount of time with the best kind of work we can do, and that's it.
Yeah, I echo the same sentiments. I should say that the vast majority of comments that I get are quite positive, quite polite, and most of the time, the people who make contributions, well, most of the time, quite often, you can see that it has the person doing the contribution put a lot of effort into it. So so that those are the easy cases, and well, I shouldn't say easy. You can build up on their work and have an interesting conversation, and most of the time it goes the work completes quite nicely, quite pleasantly. And in some rare cases, as Gary mentioned, people are demanding, and they it's just more what is it called, they demand something, and they don't propose any solutions. They're like, oh, why aren't you doing this? um, um, I'm at a loss I'm trying to find the correct word. They reproach. Is that English? They reproach. Yeah. But it's quite rare. I mean, I would say it's maybe 1 in 100 exchanges. So most of the time, things go quite nicely, I should say.
I'd like to see the organizations that rely on open source, and profit from it, um, contribute back in some way, whether that means financially sponsoring the projects that they have, or some way of feeding that into the projects that they use, ideally in some proportion to how they use them. But also contribute, like you say, the emotional support, the community. So give your staff time to contribute, meaningful time, and that contribution may not be code contributions. It may be taking the good culture that you've developed in your office and bringing that out to the open source community and modeling that for others, and showing how to build, how to work through difficult problems. In fact, that's one of the things I've learned at Google, is how to use a Google Doc as a means of communication and development and design. And so I've started doing that, more in GitHub and whatnot, working through what are the trade-offs and making that open and visible for others to see.
There's another point that I should mention, is so I know of some organizations which are built around promoting open source, and these organizations actually have funds available, and I think one of the ways of helping open source is sponsoring or funding projects. And this is very, very rare, right? So there are very few organizations which actually, there are individuals which sponsor projects on GitHub, but we're talking about very, very small amounts of money. I mean, it's ridiculously small amount of money. But still, I should say, when somebody does the effort of sponsoring, maybe even if it's $5, it's quite pleasant. But you can't live off that, right? And I know for a fact that there are organizations with really significant amount of funding, and they're still hesitating to fund projects, open source projects, and their excuse is, oh, how do we know which projects to fund? There are so many of them. So this is an excuse not to do anything. And I think that you can divide the funds that you have available into 30 equal parts and help 30 different projects, or some other number, I don't know, 20, 50, whatever the number is. And since there are so many users at the end, this will actually add up to some significant amount. And I can maybe mention actually Tidelift, of course, which helps projects. Let's not forget Tidelift. And there is recently the German Ministry of Economics, which has relatively significant fund, or actually I should say quite a large fund. And this is what they're doing. They're selecting a number of projects and helping them on a multi-year basis, which is, I mean, our projects were selected. I'm really extremely grateful for that. And I hope other organizations will join them and fund open source projects. I think it would be very much appreciated.
I just wanted to share that again. While I've been here at Gartner, the conference, the one thing I saw is a lot of companies are starting to build a new group within their organizations called the Open Source Programs Office. You all may be familiar with it. It is still a very, very early trend, but we've engaged with several high level people in the OSPO organizations. But the sad thing is they still don't have a lot of sort of dollars really to give back to the open source community. But we're hoping that efforts like this, they continue sort of gaining the momentum and gaining support from the stakeholders, the business stakeholders, with the value that open source is bringing to the community. Um, but let me move on to the next question. I'll actually want to bring in some survey data that we found in this very recent maintainer survey that we published. We found that a resounding majority, or 3/4 of the maintainers who today do not get paid for maintaining the projects that they maintain, would actually prefer for them to get paid for doing the work they do. I would like to ask, what's your perspective on maintainers getting paid for their work? What's your perception of the current state of the union regarding maintainer compensation as a whole? And I know this sort of alludes to some of the topics we've been talking about, but maybe, again, Jackie, if you have a thought or two to share about this topic.
So I've actually learned about Tidelift through a friend, and he said, "Oh, I'm maintaining such and such project, not a well-known project," and he mentioned the amount that he was receiving, and he told me, you should contact Tidelift, and I did, and I'm very happy I did. And the reason I'm mentioning this is it's because we don't. I can speak for myself. I didn't have this. I wasn't aware of this possibility of receiving compensation for doing open source work. So I've been doing this for a long time, and most of the time, for a very long time, I did open source work in my free time, and I did consulting completely on unrelated projects. And it is only recently that I'm discovering that you can actually earn a living by doing open source. And I think, well, it's a discovery for me, and I hope that this will become a possibility for other people as well. And that might require further changes in the mentality of everybody involved.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with what Tidelift was doing. When I heard the story from Donald, I thought, oh, this is something. I love it, right? I want to be a maintainer. I want to be a sponsor. I want to be a shareholder, right? This is a really good idea. And I ended up just being a maintainer, and that's fine, a lifter. But it's such a great concept because they're trying to feed these resources back in a fair way, creating this system. And it like you say, Ceki, it's working. It's actually providing these channels. I've tried other systems. I've tried GitHub sponsors and haven't gotten any traction on that. I see others using Patreon and things, and maybe there's some success there, but the fact that it's institutionalized, the way that Tidelift is institutionalized it and built a model for fairly paying maintainers, building, taking the value and translating that to compensation is such a great idea. I've tried other things too when it comes to bugs that I want to get solved. I want to get some contribution on. I've tried using bounty source. I found that ineffective. Like I could post a bounty, but then the money just sits there. I've since just started posting my own bounties. I'll go into a GitHub and say, I'll pay $100 to somebody who solves this. And sometimes that works, but usually it doesn't. And in a lot of cases, by the time somebody fixes it, they say, please just donate that to a charity. So they're not doing it for the bounty. They're doing it for the credibility or to get the work done. So a lot of times the finances isn't what it is. It's just about creating the incentives, some incentive, the right incentive for the right people. But yeah, I love Tidelift.
Yeah, I think my perspective is very similar to all of this. From using GitHub sponsors and receiving monthly contributions that are, one drink a week kind of thing, to receiving one-off large contributions, and also being at an employer that allows me to do some contribution. Emphasis on the word some, right? Because it's obviously focused on the business needs. But I think the Tidelift model is it really feels like it's the only way to have a project be successful in the long term. Not a week, a month, or a year, but really in the longer term. And when we think about all the software stacks that are out there, I mean, that's really what's required. I just don't see how people can be motivated otherwise. I mean, I know people that will never take money. It's just against their makeup. And it's not even an issue of ethics, really. If for some reason, I mean, there's as many different reasons there are different kinds of people that I've encountered for this issue. But I think there's a reason why corporations employ people and pay them, because that's the best way to get work done. So I don't see how open source can succeed long term without that. I mean, somebody's got to pay the mortgage and the electricity bill and the tuition and all that. So I think even if you're, working for a company that gives you 20% of your time to do whatever you want, you're still getting paid, you know. So I think that getting paid should be considered normal, not out of the ordinary.
I just wanted to say that this conversation is warming my heart because literally when I first started at Tidelift 5 years ago, Donald's big thing was he's like, Donald Fisher, our CEO, just to clarify for folks listening, he wants maintaining a project to be a full-time job. Like he wants kids when they're like 8 years old to be like, I want to grow up and be a full-time open source maintainer. And if that happens, just imagine how much more cool open source projects and ideas will be out there. It's super awesome. So it makes me very happy to hear you all say that.
Yeah, I think everyone here at Tidelift has that core belief at heart, right? That we want to level the playing field a little bit more. But let me, without further ado, get into my next question. Jason, you talked about this very briefly, but what we're seeing is there's so many initiatives towards identifying and remediating just vulnerabilities. You talked about bounty programs and such, but can you explain the impact of, vulnerabilities? This goes back a little bit to the beginning of the conversation. The impact of the vulnerabilities on your ability to get work done, on improving the projects, right? Like building new features. We talk to organizational users who say, well, we want new features. Are you going to tell maintainers to build new features? And they're like, no, we'll never do that. But then they also want vulnerabilities addressed as soon as they come up, right? So how does that balance of affecting your joy of maintaining those projects that you're responsible for?
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm just lucky or in an ecosystem that's less vulnerable or what, but the number of vulnerabilities I've had to deal with in the last decade is, in a handful, maybe 10, so one a year, it's totally manageable. But even then, Tidelift is the first responder on that, right? So I've already got support, somebody to help shepherd that and be emotional support or actual technical support if I ask for it, and really make sure that somebody is there responding even if I'm not responsive. So that's been great, and it hasn't really been an issue for me in terms of interruptions. And most of the time, I find the reports to be actionable in some way. They provide some insight and value, even if they're not threatening users in the end.
I think what I can say there is I can't make more time, but I can choose how I spend my waking hours. And so when it comes time to, juggling 5 balls and somebody throw the 6th one at you and it says CVE on it, well, something's going to fall on the floor. I'm not that good of a juggler. So the tricky part with CVEs is, at least within the Apache ecosystem, these are kind of all secret until it's solved and released. Usually that's what happens. We come out with a new release of the product, and once it's posted out there, then we send out an email and it says, by the way, there's a CVE that we've accepted and it's been fixed in this version. So we never do it the other way around. but I don't really have a formal process for any of this. I mean, when Log4Shell came in, I mean, that the whole team, stopped what they were doing and we dealt with that. I mean, I happened to have been on vacation that week, so vacation, bye-bye. But that's my choice, right? But yeah, I think maybe we can do a better job of educating people what our internal processes are when there are any. New features versus bug fix versus security. It's that's one of the things about doing an open source project. You kind of do what tickles your fancy.
Um, so in December 2021, I think it was December 7th, I believe, or December 9th, when I learned about Log4Shell. A few days later, I received a bug report from somebody with a Chinese name, and they described a bug in Logback. And the thing is, what they described was a vulnerability of a similar nature, but of a lesser severity. And anyway, to cut a long story short, so my initial reaction was, okay, this is not really a vulnerability. And the person actually showed a way how it could not be used directly, but it could be used by a prior vulnerability to escalate to something much more severe. Okay, and in that case, I realized that it wasn't something that one could discard. And finally, I went to there's this organization which assigns CVE numbers. I don't know if you know, and this organization is national. So I went to the Swiss organization and I described my problem. And I said, look, this is the vulnerability and I would like to get a number for it. And a day later, they replied and they said, no, this is not a vulnerability. So, I had to explain to them this was a vulnerability. And two days later, they came back to me and they said, are you really sure that it's a vulnerability? Because we think that it's not a vulnerability. Are you really certain? I said, yes, I am certain. I would like a number. And the next day they said, oh, we had an internal discussion. Well, yeah, maybe a few hours later, not the next day, a few hours later. And they said, okay, it is your choice. You're the maintainer of the software package. It is your decision. Even if we don't agree, we will provide you a number. And they gave me the number. And the funny thing is, a few weeks later, the proof of concept contributed by this Chinese person disappeared. So, and you're like, yeah, why? And this links back to apparently to the Chinese government's policy of requiring that vulnerabilities go first reported to the Chinese government, and the Chinese government decides what happens next. So I guess this person didn't have the prior authorization and got scared and removed his proof of concept repository on GitHub. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is, Log4Shell, that month of December was quite incredible, and I don't think I'll ever live anything like it ever again.
Thank you for your perspectives on that. I think the one thing that I definitely took away is that Gary is a far better juggler than I am. I'm happy if I can toss one ball up in the air and catch it. but jokes aside, here's our last conversation topic for the day. So we're seeing several initiatives coming through, such as the OpenSSF Scorecards project, the NIST Secure Software Development Framework. We've actually found that, through our survey, that more than half of the respondents to the survey are unaware of these initiatives to bring standards into open source. So I have a multi-part question for you all. What are your thoughts on these types of efforts to bring standards into open source? Are you aware of them? How are you approaching them as a maintainer? And then, what do you think is fair to expect from you as a maintainer? I'm happy to repeat those questions if needed.
Sure, yeah. So I'm sort of aware of these standards. I don't particularly follow it, but because I'm a lifter with Tidelift, I've been invited to be more involved, been incentivized to look into these standards and these changes and see how they might affect projects. Like I'm approaching it with a little bit of skepticism. I'm concerned. I want to be cautious not to add too much process because right now, I have a very small margin of budget, time budget to work on the projects, and if all of that budget is spent on addressing a secure development framework, that's going to leave the rest of the project essentially abandoned, and I don't want to do that. So I need to find a good balance. I need to find a way to be as compliant with this and to give feedback to the process so that they understand that there's a graded tier here, right? Yes, we all care about security. We're not going to do anything that puts security at risk, right? We're going to take some measures, practical steps that would be fair for any project to accept at the scale that it operates. And so I'm interested in helping there, and I just want to find reasonable steps to improve the security that minimally impede the productivity of the project.
So I have a very pragmatic view on this kind of stuff, which is my TLDR of it is if you care about something, give me a tool, something that's not going to suck up my time. And so at some point, a couple of months ago, people were saying, well, SBOMs are important. So I'm like, well, okay, great. I found, there's an SPDX Maven plugin. There's a Cyclone DX Maven plugin. Which one should I use? I don't know. So I use them both. So if you want something very, it's got to turn into something very specific, not vague rules of development or guidelines. Use GFA. That's pretty concrete. Okay, let's do that. Run, these kinds of checks. If something can be enforced at build time, so that not only I can validate a release, but also, equally important, I can validate pull requests just the same way. If your pull request breaks, whatever current development practices and checklist we have, great. That is less work for me to do. And all I have to do is describe the project requirements to the maintainers and to the people who submit PRs.
So I echo exactly the same sentiments as Jason and Gary. The process has to involve a reasonable amount of additional whatever work, and there should be tools. I'd like to mention one tool which I found quite interesting. It's called, I don't have it here. There's one of the SLF4J received a grant last year to have a security audit by professional or specialized company, and one of their requests or comments was that build should be reproducible, and so we put that in place. But again, how do you know that the build is reproducible? And let me see. So there is somebody from Sonatype actually built a tool called Reproducible Builds, and they maintain a list of reproducible builds by version. So that's very cool. Now, in the Java world, for example, when we build something using Maven, that's the build tool that I use as like many other projects. It gets the release gets pushed into a central repository called Maven Central, and the artifact that gets pushed is accompanied by a signature, digital signature, right? So it's kind of useful to know if the artifact that you're using actually matches the signature. So you can do the verification, the matching of the signature and the binary, the artifact, by hand, and some people do it, but most don't. The vast majority of users don't. But there's a tool which allows you to do this check automatically. And my question is, how do you know that this tool, at least just to take one specific case, how do you know that this tool is not corrupt? Because if you corrupt this tool, you can do whatever you want, right? So that's my question to the listeners.
I was just gonna, when you were talking about the signing, that reminded me. At one point, a user requested that I add commit signing to my Git commits, and I thought that's a great idea. I'd love to do that. How do I do it? And I still am not aware of a good instruction manual on how to set this up. Or the ones that give you instructions, they leave you in a state where you have to enter your password on every commit. If you want to get something set up where it remembers the key in a secure keychain and just runs as smoothly as everything else, that's a lot more work, and you have to kind of put a bunch of pieces together. So that's an area where, as people build up better systems, instruction manuals, playbooks on how to do these things, it will get easier. And once it's easier, then we'll take those on.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, what I heard, I think the most important aspect of this last part of the conversation was simplicity to what you're being asked to do, because it's in addition to all the other things you're doing anyways. And then to sort of sum up what Gary and Jackie, you both had to say was, transparency about, what is being asked and the tools that you're being asked to use. Transparency, so you have faith and you have trust in using those tools, that they're going to do the right thing for your projects, right? But yeah, I think this has been an amazing conversation. I feel very privileged that I was part of it. Very appreciative. But I'll turn it over to you, Amy.
Yeah. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute delight, especially to hear directly from maintainers across multiple ecosystems, because obviously you live different experiences within your various ecosystems. And thank you for everything that you do, honestly, for keeping the world running, because that's what you're doing, basically.
Thank you
so thank you so much.